Ha! Controlling our destiny, taking ourselves in the right direction, often requires us some introspection on our past, so that we might see where we were and how far we've come, and that our abilities have grown and developed as a result of it, because otherwise we'll be utterly lost. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Campaign Creation series. My name is Guy and today we're looking at the real Tiamat. Really, this is the actual real Tiamat. We now understand that Babylon is this convocation, this conflagration, this condemnation of political aspiration and clay, lots of clay, and prettiness and clay. So that means we need to start to then understand why it was that they needed to kill a god in order to really become famous. So they did that by creating the ultimate evil, the ultimate goddess. And this is obviously drawn from earlier ideas. There's lots of Sumerian influence, Akkadian influence. Those were empires that had controlled Babylon earlier and before that sort of time period. But this is the Babylonian creation myth, if you like. And it's very similar to most creation myths from that early kind of time period. You're going to see that as we go through. So Tiamat was the goddess of salt water. Why salt water? Well, her husband was the god of fresh water. And fresh water in Babylonian context is the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. Great big flowing rivers that are reliable. And yes, they have some rapids, but they generally are pretty controlled and good. The ocean, on the other hand, as far as the Babylonians were concerned, was this gigantic expanse of insane Indian Ocean, which would ravage ships and was infinite in its anger and its hatred for those that seemed to want to sail upon it. So we make Tiamat the goddess of salt water. Now it should be pointed out that at this time in Babylonian history, there's a lot of thought that perhaps there was a lot more matriarchal power. A lot more women were in charge. They were allowed to read and be educated, as we know. So perhaps it was more of a matriarchy that reigned over this particular area, and if not as kings, but certainly as equals. There was a shift to patriarchy, however, where the men were in charge. And as a result, this creation myth fitted that perfectly in terms of pushing the political agenda. The man, the male god, calm river, reliable, brings us food, is regularly flooding, but we know that it's going to happen. Woman, tempestuous, fickle as the oceans that are so distant and that are just, they're violent and wild and unpredictable, and we must just, that's what they are. It's an interesting position to take, and certainly allows you to say, well, you see, this is why women come from Tiamat, and she's sort of, womanish, and as a result shouldn't be in power. It's an easy step to take, really. Well, perhaps by their standards. Whilst it might seem strange to us to have this goddess who's got weird and wonderful things attached to her, and you will see what they are later on in the video, but we must be very aware that we do not make fun of the ideologies of others. Other people have beliefs in all kinds of imaginary things or in real things to them. How they appear, how they look, all of the attributes which are ascribed to these imaginary creatures or beings of power, we must respect that the person who believes in them believes them to be true. Completely true. I mean, imagine in 1,000 years' time what we're going to think. So the real Tiamat, her husband, of course, is killed by their children. We've heard this story before. Well, in those days, it was kind of fresh off the print, or in this case, fresh off the clay, in terms of this idea that her children, the children of these two, turned upon them and decided to slay the husband and the father, the mother, to basically claim control. So her husband gets destroyed, and in her own rage and unpredictability, she gives birth to 11 monsters. Now, the different types of monsters she gave birth to, each one of them had a specific name and had a specific duty and was responsible for doing certain things and that sort of thing. But she gave birth to these 11 monsters to basically destroy her own children. Of those monsters, one of them, or some of them actually, were dragons. And that's perhaps where Dungeons and Dragons pulled their inspiration from. She gave birth to these evil dragons. She also gave birth to snakes, ferocious snakes, venomous snakes, different kinds of snakes, all kinds. She was giving birth to everything. It was just insane. Hairy beings, as they described, the hairy ones, which became, in Dungeons and Dragons parlance anyway, the Lamu, which are men-headed, lion-bodied kind of beasts. So that was an interesting one. She gave birth to scorpion men. We don't see a lot of scorpion men, and I actually want to add scorpion men to my campaign because I think they're really cool. As a six-legged, half minotaur, half centaur, but with a stinger. Anyway, fishmen, basically merfolk, male upper body, fishtail, and then bullmen, male upper, bull body. We see lots of those in Babylonian representations and things because the bull was really powerful. We also will see the bull represented later on in a way that, frankly, it's kind of disturbing. I might even go so far as to say it's, well, utterly ridiculous. But before we get there, we need to understand more about the nature of the beast. Another curious custom of the Wambanana people is to have gods that are entirely real. Every year they nominate one of their members to become the god. And for that year, that member can decree new rules about society, how life should be conducted, and at the end of the year is always entreated to journey out into the open waves of the oceans around which the Wambanana tribe have settled, and attempt to part the seas. If they can successfully do this, they are recognized as a god, and if they cannot, they are usually drowned. It's a remarkably efficient way of making sure that the gods remain relevant to the tribe, and that those that are given a position of power use it responsibly, or just have a pretty good end year before they're eventually sacrificed. I did warn you. What did she have as the goddess? She had a tail, and she had an udder. A big udder. Apparently, bulls and cows with udders were important in the Babylonian space because they ascribed this trait to her very specifically to identify, oh, that's a woman. See, she's got an udder. Anyway, she had an udder. And yes, I will make the jokes. She was also a sea serpent. Now, sea serpents, again, feature across the mythologies, from Borneo all the way through to deepest, darkest Amazon. Gigantic serpents of the sea. The Norse fought them. Everyone has fought giant serpents of one kind or another. She was considered to be a sea serpent because, of course, she was in charge of the salty sea. And it's not difficult to see. A whale from a distance does look like a long shape rather than the bulbous shape that's underneath. So you could think of it as serpents and things. And they've got terrifically terrible mouths, although not used for flesh. But you don't know that when you're a Babylonian. Anyway, when you're a Babylonian, you're very far from the ocean, so it's difficult to really get your head around that idea. She was also represented as a dragon, and again, there's that link that Dungeons and Dragons pulled on, was that she was represented as a dragon. There is some contestation as to that interpretation of the particular cuneiform that was used in the clay tablets, but generally speaking, she's accepted as a dragon. But she was also considered to be shiny. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this, but principally, she sparkled. And you're going to see why that's important a little bit later on. Sparkled, and again, udder, she's a woman. Shiny, beautiful gems and jewels and necklaces. This is my own projection here, but they really wanted to entrench that there was a feminine form that we needed to get rid of because she was dangerous. How was she dangerous? Yes, well, when one is in charge of geography, or I suppose really weather, or in this case oceanographic effects, it really makes sense to pay homage to said individuals, so that you yourself don't sort of succumb to those erratic watery movements. Although, so yes, one should pay homage, or ultimately, once you've sort of found said individual who's responsible, hand them a well-worded and very strongly worded letter of complaint, and perhaps that will influence them to change their awful ways. I've always found that worked. Of course, Mummy used to write them a letter, and whilst they were busy laughing at the letter itself, she'd then hack their heads off and make a stew in their skulls to feast her victory over them. But that probably is not what you should do, really. So we're getting to the point now where we have to figure out what to do with her. So what happens? She gets killed by the god Anu, who made all of the other gods, his brothers and sisters, swear that once he had destroyed his mother, that he would be recognized as the one ultimate power god, the leader of all of the other gods. And they all happily agreed. I think they were kind of hoping that he would be defeated and then one of them could rise to power, but he succeeded. He killed her. He smashed her skull in with a mighty club. There's a mace that was apparently used, and there was also a spear that was invincible. And those are magic items from that particular period. But very interesting research. You can go and have a look for those as well. Now, Anu destroyed Tiamat, killed her, completely vanquished her, became the principal god amongst all gods. Babylon had been angling to get a god into their city for a long time. And there was some interpretation that the name Anu could also be Marduk. The Babylonians really liked this idea because Marduk was the patron god of Babylon. And so they could then claim that Marduk dwelt within Babylon, built him a giant temple, as they were wont to do, and covered it in beautiful tiles, so that it became the seat of Marduk, and as a result, a religious centre. It became really a religious centre. There was lots of education going on. If you came from the north and needed to speak Sumerian, you could. If you came from the west or the east and you needed to speak Akkadian, you could as well. If you were so inclined, you could speak Babylonian from the south. So there was lots of opportunities to go to Babylon as the centre. So they had effectively created a reason why Babylon was to be recognized as the great city it was. They really did. I'm not saying they completely invented Tiamat just so that they could, position themselves as the premier city and go from a little minor town that no one cared about to one of the greatest cities that humankind has ever known. But they kind of did. So once she was slain, they needed to, as was pointed out, get rid of the body parts. So the tears of Tiamat, she was crying, of course she was crying, became the Tigris and Euphrates, the two rivers that are very, very important to that entire area, the Euphrates being, of course, the river that Babylon is built on. Her ribs became the vault of heaven. Wonderful, 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 wonderful idea. Oh, there's heaven up there, and it's built upon the bones of our mother. In other words, women, you've done your job, but we're now going to go above that. We're going to get into actual heaven. You've got to be a man. Again, this is all their kind of thinking, their rhetoric that may have helped shift power away from women and more towards men, because ultimately we get to a point where women are no longer educated, and then it becomes illegal to educate them later on. And her tail became the Milky Way. Remember I said she was shiny and sparkly like diamonds and gemstones? Well, her tail got thrown up into the air, and that became the Milky Way. It's beautiful, beautiful, beautiful idea. There are other creation myths about the Milky Way, which I think are absolutely better. But then again, they weren't trying to position themselves as being the premier city in the entire world. So they're not as dramatic. Anyway, that is the real Tiamat. A goddess, tempestuous, angry, invented principally to make Babylon the center of the universe and to position men above the others as a result of that. It's an interesting one. These kind of creation myths, you can't make up, because of course there was all kinds of love in that space between herself and the monsters she made. And anyway, the real Tiamat, I think, is, I don't want to say more interesting, but I'm utterly convinced that if you included this type of monstrous thing, that your players are going to sit back and go, well, that is the real Tiamat. Until next time, I wish you and yours the very happiest of campaign creation, and a big thanks to World Anvil, worldanvil.com, sponsors of today's show.
Well, once you have a body, it's more about how and what you do with it that's important. Generally speaking, you want to get rid of it. You don't want to leave it just laying there, or it's about covering your tracks. So some people, they like to cut up the body. Different pieces get sent all over the place. Hell, the English even had a term for it. Drawn and quarters, they'd say, and then they'd split the 4 parts into 4 different areas of the country. That's just 4 different funerals, in my opinion. No, the best way to get rid of a body is to turn it into something else. You know, like stars or an ashtray. Well, maybe not an ashtray. You'd need a pretty big ashtray. I mean, that would be a serious smoker going on. That might raise some flags.